one of the key assumptions that I made about the way that my game was going to be designed was wrong. And as I began the process of going through and trying to come up with a systems design for how the game would work, I began to understand there was something that I was overlooking. And this was critical if I was going to make something that was scalable in the future. So, what I'm talking about is the model view controller design pattern, and I'll use this design pattern as a way of describing my problem. So, when I was doing the software architecture map, I began to understand that this was going to be incredibly complicated to code and to consistently code it. And I was making errors during the coding process on earlier stages of the project. And this made me very conscious of just how error prone as a coder, a person tends to be. And I began to think there's got to be a better way to scale this thing up because there's immediate problems that come up there. The first problem is as I'm creating new cards to add to the system, or if I'm adding new species to the system, or if I'm adding new campaigns to the system, or if I'm choosing to create, for instance, a card that does something that no other card has done before. This all creates new opportunities to code. And I think that generally speaking, it's a bad idea to hoist so much on the role of a single person, a person who understands design, understands the architecture, and understands the way that the code is working. And so understanding it is probably best described through the model view controller design pattern. So model view controller is a design pattern for software architecture that describes the way that users interact with a game or any kind of software system. And it involves three components and an audience. So the first component is the model, and the model is essentially all the things that are happening underneath the surface, the raw mechanics, the engine of the thing. The second component is the view component. The view component is what we like to think of as the feedback system of the user interface. So the model displays through the view to the user or the audience. The final component is the controller component. The controller component is the way that we interact with the model. So we interact with the controller, and the controller will manipulate the model. And so this flow is a way of understanding the way that an audience and a model interacts at a base level. And of course, when you're coding, you want to think of every class in terms of whether it's a model class, a view class, or a controller class. So for anybody who doesn't understand what a class is basically a role or an operation, a method that occurs inside of a software program like C#, which is what is used in Unity. So you may have a class that is a view class that is specifically for the purpose of interacting with the audience or feeding back to the audience. You may have a controller class that's specifically designed for the audience to interact with the model. And so if we can think about view, controller, and model classes, we understand better what these classes are doing and how they interact with one another. Now, my basic assumption was that there was going to be two users. And so there would be a GM and a player who would interact through the GM's hub and the player's module. So there would be two kinds of view classes, two kinds of controller classes, and one underlying model that both the GM and the player would be interacting with. This assumption was wrong. This assumption was terribly, terribly flawed because of all the questions that I brought up earlier. In truth, there is also a third, the game designer. So the game designer interacts with the underlying model just the same way that the GM or the player does. but it happens in a very different way. And it should happen through the Unity editor. So if, for instance, I defined a stat, and I wanted to replicate the stat, let's say it's a base stat, so vitality, right? I create vitality, and then I create physique, and then I create coordination. I create all these base stats with their basic properties. Ideally, that's not the role of a programmer. The role of the programmer would be to say, this is what a stat is. And then the role of a game designer is physique or vitality is a new iteration of stat. And so the stat class and all of its attributes and elements can be replicated over and over and over again in order to be able to create something which is extensible, that's scalable, that's efficient. But if a programmer has to do that on every single instance, it's problematic for scaling this thing. And with a stat, you have a really simple way of looking at it. But when you start thinking about the way that cards operate and how, as I mentioned in the previous video, a card is essentially a grouping of different operations, that you have individual component operations and that those things sit within cards, and then the cards interact with other cards that create actions that in turn the player can use to interact with the setting and the situation. But if you're trying to create all those individual operations and all those individual cards in code, how many times you're going to have opportunities for faults to pop up in the process? It would be a lot simpler if the game designer could not interact directly with the base code in order to be able to create those new things, cards, operations, which are, building these things up. But to do that, I have to recognize that there is a new role interacting with the underlying model, because the model is the code base. So that means that new controller classes and new view classes will be needed in order to interact with the game designer. And the best way for me to do this is through the Unity editor. So I just became aware of the Unity editor as a tool that exists within Unity to be able to represent underlying functions, and for a person to never actually touch the code base to be able to modify and improve upon it. And so what I've decided to do with the systems design now is I am now thinking of the model as an expression of the simplest components of the game, and then I'm going to provide the necessary feedback mechanisms so that in the Unity editor, we can create new operations, we can assemble new operations into cards, and then we can do other things like disciplines and other design elements like races and stats and characters and all that other kind of stuff. All is architected above that. It all grows out of what is essentially the underlying components of the model. And so now that I'm thinking about it in this way, it becomes much clearer what the model needs to be, what all the components of that model needs to properly express for the game. This ends up being a superior way for me to work, but it's not just going to be superior for me to work, it's also going to make it possible that in the future, when I bring in, if for instance we're successful and this thing gets out there and a lot of people start using it and there's a lot of demand for new content to be dropped in there, it becomes possible for me to bring new game designers into the fold to develop the cards, adapt things, without ever having to dive down into the basis of the code and potentially create a lot of problems. So this was an eye-opening experience for me, And moving forward, I'm definitely going to be thinking about things differently.